When HiFiMan came out with the HE1000, they were $3,000, and at the time nothing had really broken, say about the $2,600 barrier, so there are people who went absolutely apoplectic at that price. Nowadays it's not such a surprise with even the $8,000 Susvaras out there, as well as other headphones. But what's interesting now is the new unveiled version is only $2,700, and once you account for inflation since the original version was released, these are actually quite a bit cheaper than they were before. Now, of course, the unveiled factor of these is that they no longer have a grill or screen on the back. If we look at this pair of Aria Organics, which have the same setup as the HE1000s did, they have the magnets, which you can see on the back of the unveiled, are actually in there, but there's a mesh and this grill. And I guess part of the reason for making them, well, unveiled like the Susvara unveiled, is that the diaphragms are so thin that even when you're playing back music on them, you can stick your hands out here and the sound changes from the reflections off your hands. So having less reflecting sound on the outside makes for a sonic improvement. Now, of course, if you saw the Susvara unveiled, you saw quite significant gaps between the magnets. The gaps here are much smaller, so there's less danger of, well, stuff getting in there, especially if I left it on a desk nearby some loose screws or whatever. But they do have protective covers for the outside if you want to cover them up. The biggest problem I have is that in my house I have a lot of jumpy spiders, which is good because they eat little tiny creatures I would otherwise never see. But they tend to build webs between they probably build webs between the magnets of this pair of headphones. So being able to protect from that is a good idea. But otherwise, the HE1000s have the same typical HiFiMan ergonomics that you have with the Aria series and the HE1000 series, which is very comfortable spring steel headband, but they've gone for an all metal design, unlike the wood, plastic and metal design of this and the Aria and original HE1000 series, something which I actually like. I commented, I remember, when I had the HE1000 and the HE1000 V2s, which incidentally I bought from HiFiMan originally and then sold sometime later when I jumped up to owning Focal Utopias. At that time I thought that the Edition X setup with an all metal outside looked actually nicer, and so I'm kind of glad they've gone down that route. This does look quite pleasant. Now, it's not quite as fancy as, say, something like a Meze, Empyrean or Elite, but if you want the kind of presentation that HiFiMan headphones have, well then, yeah, you just accept things as they are. Now, the cable with them, which I find perfectly adequate, is a really long, both they have a 3.5mm terminated and 4-pin XLR terminated cable. I think the same one as on the Susvara Unveiled. It's fairly straightforward. It does the job. It has a nice kind of cloth coating in there. I think underneath it's still got that rubber. It feels like it's got rubber hose under there still. Not quite as elegant as some of the fancy braided cables, of which I have heaps floating around from both ZMF and Meze, but it does the job quite adequately, and I don't feel I need to make any kind of upgrade, even though I am the kind of person who may find occasionally that some headphones like having a cable upgrade. And now I do tend to use shorter cables, say from Meze, especially since they make 3.5mm terminated cables, and the HiFiMan headphones use 3.5mm terminations, which means it's more convenient since my headphone amps are next to me rather than somewhat further away. Lastly, of course, the earpads and headpad are readily replaceable. It's a little bit fiddly to get the screws out to replace the headpad, but I did it recently on the Susvaras, which are behind me, because that eventually wore out. But generally, I'd find the only kind of negative to this design is the super thin diaphragms may not be as robust as something like the dynamic drivers in this Atrium here from ZMF. And so, as you know, I hang everything carefully around the room. They are definitely not for use in a portable scenario. But what you do get in exchange, I think, is pretty good. Now, before we go any further, HiFiMan are sponsoring my channel and sponsoring some of my trips to CanJam. Now, regardless of that, there is no precondition on this sponsorship. HiFiMan actually want me to talk about their products exactly as they are and present them exactly and clearly as possible, the good and maybe the not so good. Like you, I watch YouTube to decide whether or not to buy products, and I do go through reviews of products, and I don't really care who sponsors them as long as the review goes through how the features work of the product, the good points and the bad points, and then I get a clear idea of whether or not that product might actually suit me. Likewise, that's what I aim to do with reviewing headphones and other gear, is just present the product as it is. You know, some things I do like, some things I don't like, but I have a fair idea of the kind of things that people do and don't like. And if I try and explain that, then if you are in the market for buying, say, a pair of high-end headphones in this case, then I hope this video helps you decide that either the product headphones are for you or not for you. And either way works out really well, as no one likes to buy headphones and find that they're not what they expect them to be. So after this, actually, I invite, if you are an owner of the HE1000 Unveiled, sometimes people do watch videos about the products they buy, please do leave a comment with your experiences, and that will actually help other people decide if they want to buy the product or not. But anyway, on with the review. Now, I generally ran the HE1000s out of something, say the TT2M scaler or that setup going through the Studio 6. It's not going to be part of this review yet because it only just arrived, the leaner system as well. Well, that's similar, very similar in presentation to the kind of TT2M scaler setup anyway. And also a stack of gear behind me, not including this cassette player that shouldn't be there. Cassette players are generally not a good idea for high-end headphones. But the main thing is that the HiFiMan headphones do something which I think a lot of headphones don't do quite as well. And that is present the music in a way that electrostatic headphones do. Now, electrostatic headphones, back when I first joined HeadFi, for example, back in about 2008, they tended to be like the best of the best. If you wanted the best sound quality, you'd buy an electrostatic headphone. The problem with that, as I've explained in prior videos, is that you get one pair of headphones that only works with the electrostatic amp, and the electrostatic amp only works with the electrostatic headphones. They do not work with all this stuff. Well, apart from the DACs, obviously, to plug into the headphone amp. But the presentation you get tends to be very light, airy, and extremely detailed, and not always have so much slam. If you want slam, then you end up spending, maybe now you'd be spending over $6,000 for an amp, or DIYing yourself, even with a few $1,000s worth of parts. They are just not conducive to having both, you know, an airy, detailed sound and a lot of slam without spending a lot of money. You don't need to do that with the HE1000s, but you will get that airy sound and a fair bit of slam. Not a huge amount, I'll talk about that with music, for even something somewhat more moderate, including HiFiMan's own Serenade and this VO K17 behind me. Now, for example, I was listening to Peter Gabriel's The Veil from the same album, and you know, there's a very nice presentation where each instrument comes through from its own space very clearly. Now, there's nice tight bass and a reasonable amount of it, as the overall sound has got a little bit of warmth in the bass, which works out really very well. I tend to find them a little bit less sharp in the treble than, say, something like these Aria Organics, which works out well for me. Now, on a note here, and Resolve made a really good video about this, everyone's hearing is slightly different, especially in the mid-range and treble, and so where something that might be ear-stabbing for one person may not be so bright for another, depending on how their ears respond to different frequencies in those ranges. So do note that I'm responding from my own particular HRTF, as it's called, head-related transfer function, how much each frequency responds to me, and your experience may be slightly different. Even though the headphones didn't have quite so much slam, even though there was, to me, a slightly warm tilt, as if you look at graphs, say like the one HiFiMan sent me, which I have laminated for convenience, even though it looks flat through the bass, it actually, flat through the bass tends to sound a little bit warmer than neutral for various reasons. But even though it doesn't have slam, it's the tightness and precision more than makes up for that in my book. In that regard, something like classical jazz, such as Cannonball Adderley, Bill Evans and the like, and I was listening to Know What I Mean from the Riverside profiles of Cannonball Adderley, and even though that, to me, there's a slight roll-off in the treble, and I tend to find that classical jazz albums tend to be a little bit darker sounding than, say, more modern jazz albums, it didn't stop the details of, say, the cymbals coming through, as the nuances of each saxophone note came through really very well. It was about spot on for me. Now, the soundstage in that case has a nice balance of width, not being super wide, say like a pair of HD800s or HD800Ss, but more significantly, the soundstage, inside that soundstage, being able to hear where everything is precisely, I think mattered more and made for a really nice presentation. Contrast that to something like the Atriums, which I have in here, or the Calderas from ZMF, which tend to have maybe a bit more pulled back mid-range, and you end up getting more slam in the bass and more exciting overall sound, as Zach has let through some of the resonance of the wood carefully to give you a little bit more an interesting sound, but especially with these atriums can end up sounding a little bit boomy in the odd track. It's a little bit of a different presentation, and it's more closed in, whereas if I switch then to the HiFiMan HE1000 Unveiled, ends up becoming more open. In that more open sound makes me feel that the bass has emotion. And it's of course a different kind of emotion that you get from something like a ZMF. I don't feel like it's too much or too little, and it's precision of the way it's delivered that makes me feel it's about right. If you like a lot more bass, you can always grab something like, say, a Shure Audio Lock S and turn up one of the left-hand two dials and give yourself more bass if you really need it for the odd track that does. And the good thing is something like a large planar diaphragm will respond to that quite well. Now with some HiFiMan headphones, I tended to find, like the original HE1000s before they modified them to the V2, to have something of a slightly hot treble. Some of it was tuning, some of it was maybe resonance, making things sound a little bit too sharp. Especially, you notice this in the mid-range if there's a little bit of resonance, that things can come through too hot, and I find the Susvara Unveiled has a little bit of that. Something I might talk about in a separate video, even though I have already reviewed them. I did some experiments on that. If you're really interested in seeing that, do post a comment. But I find that the HE1000 Unveiled, like the V2s I originally owned, have reduced that, and so they don't end up sounding quite so hot, but sound more smooth. And that a touch of that smoothness may be from not having quite as much detail as, say, the Susvara Unveiled or maybe a pair of Focal Utopias, but it ended up balancing it overall quite nicely. Now I also used the setup of Shure Audio's Mjolnir with the R27HE as a DAC, and it's fed by HQ Player and a Singzer SU1 using I2S. It's a very carefully set up system, and that works out very well. I can use the R27HE directly as well with the headphones, but I wanted just that touch more soundstage you get from an external amp like the Mjolnir. In that, I listened to Diane and Carmien, and I'm not going to try Guten Morgen Duft. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. That's one of actually my favorite tracks, and ironically, that pair of DJs got me into listening to jazz at a friend's recommendation. They actually have an album where they took their father's old kind of jazz music and they combined it with a kind of modern take on it, and that you see their fathers on the front on the album cover. I think it's a really good crossover between classical jazz and modern music, and it got me more interested in jazz way back many years ago. And listening to that, I think something that came across listening with that, as it is a mixture of instruments and beats and the like, is that instrument timbre through the HE1000s, due to the slightly not quite flat mid-range, the slightly stronger bass, slightly stronger treble. The mid-range balance makes the instrument timbre of some instruments such as piano seem slightly not quite right. And a good comparison of this may be Dan Clark Audio's E3s, which are tuned to the Harman curve, which is more or less approximately what a pair of high-end speakers sounds like. Now, while I don't really like the Harman curve personally, and it's a preference curve, please ignore the idea that it's something that manufacturers must conform to. That's absolute nonsense. While the timbre of something like the DCA E3s is more correct, and maybe a touch mid-forward for my tastes, in contrast, the HE1000s seem a little bit imbalanced through the mid-range, and something I've tended to notice with other headphones and even some IEMs, where they have a less than perfect transition through the mid-range to the treble. Now, it was the treble in that Diane and Carmien track which made me slightly doubt the way piano was presented by the HE1000s. It wasn't a huge issue to me. Like if these were my only headphones and I wasn't a reviewer, I probably wouldn't notice quite so much. But it's something having listened to a lot of gear and even live instruments that I can tend to notice more. It was the kind of bloomy, tasteful mid-bass, somewhat like Meze Give, where they have a more north of neutral bass that makes kind of everything pleasant to listen to, whether it be jazz or something more modern. And that ends up working out quite well. For example, modern pop, Swept Away by Cult with No Name, that smoothly floats out from the headphones without sounding, too weak or thin, despite the kind of seemingly like electrostat light, floaty electrostat-like presentation. And for the most part, each note becomes something of an event. You know, every note, you tend to feel it. And that's the kind of feeling you want to have from a very resolving pair of headphones. You get more of that, say, with the Susvara Unveiled, which takes that to another level. But if I'd never heard the Susvara Unveiled, I probably find the HE1000s to be extremely good in that regard. Now, a random track I came across, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Pierre Bensusan, and the track is called Intuit. It's a live track from a live album called Encore, and I'll put the name in the description. Apologies if I've mispronounced it. Now, this was a guitar track, and the guitar notes using, say, the Studio 6, which I have a Pavane Summit tube in now, and Pavane sent me this in for review. I'll put a card up with a link to that. I've got that in there with a set of even slightly warmer Brimar tubes, and the overall tilt to this setup is a bit on the warm side, which can be very pleasant, like HiFiMan Serenade, which can have a slight warm tilt. Works out very well with, some of the brighter headphones, such as the Aria Organics. So with that setup, the lower notes seem slightly stronger, and that's again where I noticed the timbre thing, than the higher notes. And so that made for a slight timbre imbalance, especially when you have a musician playing across a large range of, quite a number of octaves, then you tend to notice that a bit. But the headphones really kept up with the speed of the track. When the track gets fast, that was an important thing you get out of high-end headphones, that you don't get any blur. You get every note is sharp no matter how fast things are going. And that was both with the the macro detail and the micro detail. Everything was all there. Now the Susvara Unveiled, that of course has the last word in detail, but the HE1000 Unveiled does seem slightly warmer in comparison, giving a slightly better feel of body to the notes, and without losing any of that airiness that the HiFiMan headphones tend to have. And, the treble to me was kept in check just enough to be about right for my ears. Again, the only kind of thing with having that warmer note sound is that the timbre wasn't quite as good as it could be, or as good as I've heard out of other headphones. Something completely different, Bonobo, and I've probably mentioned Bonobo many times. I really liked how Bonobo combines sometimes world music with, just like Diane and Carmien take jazz and modern music, and then Bonobo takes world music and modern music and mixes it up in a way that's really interesting. Now, I'm not even going to begin to try and pronounce this musician, but it was from an album, Bonobo's album Migration. There's a wonderful soundstage spread with this track. The HE1000 Unveiled, bringing out a nice balance of punch and detail with all the instruments distinct and not the least congested as the track gets busy, much like the guitar track I just mentioned. Now, the sound doesn't punch your ears, say like a ZMF Caldera does. Instead, balancing the delivery of detail and details of the voices and instruments with the slam of the electronically generated bass notes. And it's the tightness and the detail of that makes it, again, more enjoyable. Whereas with something like, say, a ZMF, which tends to have more punch, a fair bit more bass, or maybe in retrospect a more pulled back mid-range in the case of, say, the Atriums. Now, the HE1000 Unveiled, though, I sometimes found that percussion is a touch bright, and that tends to be a modern music factor. And even with Bonobo's track Expander from album of the same name, which is also in one of my current playlists. Now, the mid-range is quite sharp, and it brings out the instrument sometimes a bit too prominently. Depending on one's treble sensitivity, this may or may not be to taste. If it is a bit sharp, there's nothing that can't resolve with a quick twiddle of the dials and the lockiest there, which is a very handy thing to have when you maybe just want a bit more bass punch or a bit less of a hot treble. Even if it's not such a precise instrument, it's much easier than fiddling around with EQ. Although, and I'll talk about it in its own review, the K17. That is a point where I might actually talk about use with gear. Now, I wouldn't plug in, say, a HE1000 into something like a Magni, Shit Audio's Magni, or a small amp. Those amps just cannot move enough power for the bass not to end up coming bloated and out of control when you turn the volume up. I'd say go for something around the $500 mark for amplification, or combine something like this K17 from FIO, which you'll see a review of soon, or if it's already out, I'll throw up a card in the corner when I remember. The K17 and the Serenade, they're a little bit different, the Serenade being R2R and the K17 using an AKM setup, but actually both work really well with the HE1000. In both cases, if I use them as a DAC to the Shit Audio Mjolnir, the Mjolnir ends up with a slightly wider sound, more precise, and better control of the bass especially. But what I found was a really good synergy, not just with the Serenade obviously, because the warmer organic sound of something like the R2R DAC and the Serenade works really well, especially with something like the Aria Organics. but also the K17, which has a more neutral presentation, while again the bass is maybe a touch weaker than say out of a Mjolnir. That ended up bouncing out really well with the HE1000s, and the amplification is really good. It ended up being a really nice combination. And also you have that built-in PEQ, and you can chuck in a preset such as I have one with a bass boost for the time that I really want to rock out. And something like the HE1000 with large drivers does respond very well to EQ, especially if you want to boost the bass. So I do find the HE1000 Unveiled to be a good overall all-rounder like the original, well, the HE1000 V2s were. It does work with music where you need speed and detail, and at the same time it has enough warmth that it can give some slam, or you can EQ in some, like I do with the Lock Yes, if necessary. Its only negative that I really find is that, well, it doesn't look as quite as beautiful and fancy as some, it's now under $3,000 headphones do, such as say the Mezes. Some people do get nervous about the idea of having the Unveiled set up here where there's no mesh protecting the driver. Personally, it doesn't particularly worry me. And lastly, the overall timbre of instruments may not be quite perfect if you are very picky about that kind of thing. So if you do own a pair, as I said before, please do leave a comment with your own impressions. That would help out people watching this deciding whether to buy the headphones or not immensely. Also, thank you to all my patrons for sponsoring my channel and keeping it going, as well as HiFiMan for helping out in that regard too. As always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you online, or even in person at CanJam.